Okay, hello everybody. Second talk of the evening for me, but afternoon, I guess, for everybody else. Cool. Yeah, this talk is taking flight with Tailwind CSS. So let's get into it. My name is Oliver. I'm a PHP and front-end developer based in the UK. I work for a company called Invika. I do a lot of work with Drupal primarily for Invika, but also do some of my own sort of side projects and things. In different stuff. I'll talk about that in a moment. I do a lot of work with open source, so I maintain various Drupal modules and themes and Ansible roles and some Tailwind CSS plugins, particularly relevant to this talk. They're mostly on my GitHub account. I'm OP Davies on GitHub and Twitter and various places, so feel free to follow me for tips and tricks and things on Twitter. And I do blog posts on my website, which is oliverdavies.uk. So as I said, I do various different types of things. I've been doing Drupal for I think since about 2007 at this point, doing a lot of Drupal. And then more recently, I started doing some work with Symfony prior to the Drupal 8 adoption of Symfony. But also do some work with some WordPress work. I was speaking at WordCamp in the UK. I gave this talk at WordCamp in the UK. Last year, I do some work with static sites like Sculpin and Jekyll and some Laravel and some Vue.js and some other bits and pieces as well. So a nice varied sort of tech stack, but one of the common things I've been using across all these different things is Tailwind CSS. So I was quite an early adopter of Tailwind, been using it, I'm not sure exactly when it came. Let's see here, May 13th last year is when Tailwind 1.0 was released. I've been using it since like the early 0.1 or 2 versions. So I've been using Tailwind for quite a while. But what is it? There we go, good segue. Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework for rapidly building custom designs. So I like to think of it as a CSS utility class generator. You give it a config file and some things, it will generate a lot of these utility CSS classes for you, and you can then use them in your CSS. It uses PostCSS behind the scenes, which is the same thing that Auto Prefixer uses. Although you don't need to use PostCSS in your project. I tend to now. I was very much using Sass for everything and less before that. You can use Tailwind with those. I tend just prefer PostCSS across the board at this point. And the nice thing is it does say custom designs. So you can build various different sites with Tailwind that look totally different. So you don't have the common Bootstrap thing of you look at a site and go, that's built with Bootstrap. It looks like a Bootstrap website. Tailwind, you don't have that problem. Don't have that problem with the advantage of being able to reuse the same classes across projects, which is awesome. Tailwind is a highly customizable, low-level framework. So there are no components inside Tailwind CSS. There's one container component. Everything else is very low level, almost sort of CSS property level, which we'll see. So it's slightly different to like Bootstrap and Bulma and most of the other frameworks. That, you know, if you want to have a navbar, here is your HTML for your navbar. Copy paste HTML into your project, and then it's all based around that. Tailwind doesn't give you the markup; it just gives you the classes to use. It is very customizable. We'll see how to use configuration files to customize it later on. And you can extend it with custom plugins that are available on GitHub. You know, I maintain a couple. There are a couple of quite prolific Tailwind plugin creators and maintainers. Or you can write your own custom plugins as well to add your own things. Yeah, and it avoids the need to name things prematurely. So if you've got one, as a byproduct of it being quite low level, you don't need to always have like a navbar component. There's only ever going to be one navbar, so you don't need to start naming things prematurely. So this is a quote taken from the Tailwind website. Tailwind is more than a CSS framework, it's an engine for creating design systems. So it does come with a lot of good defaults. It comes with a whole range of color palettes and margin and padding, spacing, and various things for you to give you this design system out of the box. So it's also going to sort of enforce some consistency in your project. So if you've got a set of font sizes, for example, to pick from, the best practice is going to encourage you to use those set variables or set values rather than making up another sort of slightly different font size or font color, because then you don't end up with 300 font sizes on your project or something, for an example. So it does give you this sort of design system out of the box as well. These are some of the things that it generates classes for. So some of the original things. So text, border, background, colors, font size, and font weight, font family, alignment, so text align left, right, center, etc. Padding, margin, negative margin, flexbox, positioning, so positioning relative, absolute, sticky, etc. Some list styling, and Z-index, opacity, etc. There's a whole list of these things that it generates for you out of the box. These are mostly there in the really sort of early versions prior to the 1.0 release. Some of the newer stuff, which has been quite exciting in pretty much, I think, all since 1.0. Screen reader visibility, so classes like SR only and SR not SR only to show and hide things in a screen reader compatible way. Setting colors on placeholders, first child, last child, nth child selectors, which is pretty cool. CSS grid, everybody always wanted CSS grid. There's a CSS grid implementation in Tailwind now. Transitions and transforms, and spacing and divide, which is something I love, but got added into the last but one release. So something I was pulling a plugin for a long time, which is now part of core, which is pretty awesome. And all of these things and more get generated from a single customizable configuration file that we'll see. So here are some examples. This is the Laravel Nova website. So it's back in sort of admin UI for Laravel. This is built using Tailwind. This is the Firefox 10 website. So very different visually. This is also built with Tailwind, but you probably wouldn't know from like looking at these two sites. They look quite different. And this website is should be sort of familiar, I guess, to most Drupal developers in the room or on the call. This is a clone of the Bartik theme, of the default theme that comes with Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. This is built with Tailwind CSS and Vue.js. So I think it's pretty close. There's probably an hour to do just the HTML, and then another hour to do some stuff in Vue. So 2 hours overall to make this, I think, pretty cool little clone of Bartik using Tailwind. How do you use it? So this is taken again mostly from tailwindcss.com. With Tailwind, you style elements by applying pre-existing classes directly in your HTML. So it's a total reversal of what you're used to doing, right? You're not going to start opening a new CSS file and coding new CSS for every particular new thing or every component. You've got this whole library design system set of classes that already exist, that is generated for you, that you can use. And we're going to style elements straight inside the HTML by using those classes. The nice byproduct of that means that you're able to build everything, quote everything, without writing custom CSS. So there are some occasions where you're going to need to write custom CSS, but you, in most cases, don't need to or have to. So I've built UIs completely without no custom CSS using just Tailwind classes, which is pretty awesome. Some benefits are you aren't wasting time and arguably energy by inventing class names. So some examples of things I wrote class names for before were things like sidebar inner wrapper, just to be able to, give something a name so I could style it. You don't need to spend that time thinking, what is the name of this thing? Because naming things is difficult. You can just start adding classes to your things. So if something is just a flex container, you can just give it a class of flex. You don't need to think of what is something I can label it as just to make it a flex container. Your CSS stops growing. So because you've got this list of existing classes, you can just reuse. You're not going to add another style sheet for every new component and keep growing your custom CSS every time. And making changes feels safer, at least in my experience. I'm much happier going in and changing, being able to see what is affecting the element that I'm looking at and making changes to it directly inside that HTML markup file, rather than going into the CSS and worrying that a change that I make there is going to affect everything else. So here's this is an animation on the Tailwind website that I've just broken down into screenshots, but you can get some idea of how it works. So this is a contact card component. There's some base examples already that we can see, like BG white to give it a white background, and rounded LG to give it some rounded corners, which you may or may not be able to see on the screen. Maybe in the bottom ones with the shadow you can probably see. And the image has height and width. So H for height, width, for W for width, and then a value of 16 to give that image height and width. So it comes with these set values. So 4 is typically 1 rem, and then multiples of to 16. So it's 4, 12, 16. So 4 rem, I think, hopefully. So we can start by adding some padding. So P6, so padding 6, so 1.5 rem of padding to our card. We can add rounded full to our image to make it a circle, so fully rounded image. We can use MX auto to center it, so M for margin, auto for auto, and then X for the X-axis, so left and right. We could use L for left, R for right, C for top, B for bottom, or Y for vertical axis as well. X does left and right. Text LG, so text large on our H2 to make that text a little bit bigger. Text purple 500, so the text is going to be a color purple. And again, there's a set of different values for purple that range from 100, I believe was the lowest. I think it may be 50 now in one of the latest ones. Up to 900 being the darkest. So pick the color that you want. So purple 500 is sort of in the middle. Gray 600 for our text to make the text gray, slightly off black. Text center is going to center the text. We can now introduce a responsive class. So on line 1 there, we can see MD:flex. So we're going to make everything a flex container. So use Flexbox, but only on medium screens. So everything in Tailwind also is responsive, which is pretty awesome. And we'll look at that more in a minute. Again, on medium screens, we can remove that MX auto, so to reset our margin back to 0. Realign some text on medium screens. So on line 3 there, we've got MD text left. So if using a mobile first approach, which Tailwind is going to sort of suggest almost, it's going to use text center for mobile and then text left for larger screens. We can set some margin right on medium screens to 6. We can adjust our height and width, make the image larger on medium screens. What we end up with is this card. So on a small screen, we get so there's the medium size. So obviously it's wider. The image is on the left, larger image, and everything is stacked to the left-hand side there in a line. Whereas on the smaller side, everything is moved around. The image is slightly smaller. The text is all centered, and all this without writing any custom CSS, which is pretty cool. How do we install Tailwind? So there's a few different ways. that we can do this. The first is to use the CDN. So there's a version we can get from Unpackage, pkg.com, which is the whole compiled versions of everything that we're going to, every class that Tailwind can generate is going to get from there. There are some drawbacks. So there are some features like @apply and @variance that we can't use. Obviously, we can't customize it at all, so it's a CDN. You can't enable additional features, and we can't install extra plugins. So really, if you want to get the most out of Tailwind, you should install it via npm. So how do we do that? We could just use npm install and use save dev Tailwind CSS or yarn add Tailwind CSS. So this will add it to a package.json file as a dependency of your project or of your theme. Now we've added it as a dependency, we need to actually add it into our CSS. So in this case, we've got a source directory with an app.pcss. So I tend to use the PCSS for PostCSS in my source files. And notice this @tailwind directive syntax. So these are just placeholders that placeholders that PostCSS is going to replace with the generated styles that Tailwind is going to compile and generate for us. So the first section is some base styles. So it pulls in some base reset styles through Modernizer and some things. Then it's going to include some components. So it only includes one component, I believe, still, which is a container, a responsive container, and then all the utilities, which are the main things we're going to be using, all the text thread 500, etc. And we do have opportunity to write and to add some custom stuff. So the ordering is quite important. It's one thing when I see a lot of people doing blog posts and screencasts and things, they'll typically put the 3 Tailwind directives at the top and the custom stuff at the bottom, which in most cases is fine. What you don't get is that cascade. So you want to be able to have your components overriding your base styles, but then you want to be able to put a utility class on a component and have that override what you've set further up. So this is the ideal / recommended ordering. So Tailwind base, custom base, Tailwind's components, your components, Tailwind's utilities, your utilities. So this is great. We've got a source file that we can use, but now we need to process it and have Tailwind compile this for us through PostCSS. So it includes a build command that we can use. We specify our source file, so our app.pcss, PostCSS file, and then we can specify the output directory. So we're going to output this into a dist directory with app.css. And here's, it's a really short example of some of the things it's going to generate for us. So these are our text align utilities. So text left class is text align left, and same for center and right and justify. So this is fine, I think, for one-off builds. Typically, you'll want to use like something with a watcher, using Webpack or something, or Gulp. In this example, I'm going to be using Laravel Mix, which is a wrapper around Webpack. So you can include that again using npm install Laravel-mix. And again, we have a webpack.mix.js file where we configure mix. So we'll require mix at the top there. We'll use .postcss to say use PostCSS on our source file and then output it into the dist directory, basically what we just saw. And then we could pass an array of other PostCSS things we're going to want to include. So we're going to require Tailwind CSS here. If you're going to want to include other plugins, I tend to use PostCSS nested and imports and various others, and auto prefixer, you'd include them here as well. There is also a Tailwind plugin for Mix itself that you can install and require, and then just use .tailwind there as well. And this isn't the only example. Like I said, you could use this for Gulp. I use Webpack Encore if I'm working with Symfony or sometimes with Drupal. I say Gulp is a whole section on the installation docs of various ways you can use to install Tailwind and to perform this sort of step. And then what we end up with is a CSS file that we can just include in our style sheet in our head as a link, just as you would for any other thing. And then typically there'll be some scripts, some npm scripts within your package JSON file for dev and prod. So dev is just going to export everything for you, so you can use everything you want, or anything you want locally. Prod does some things like some minification and some purging, which we'll mention later on. And you can also run watch to watch for changes and also compile when something changes there. Everything pretty much has been, a lot of people look at this and go, isn't this similar to inline styles right now? Yes, I think looking at the examples we've already seen, but Tailwind also caters for interaction states. So the last time I gave this talk, I had hover, focus, active, and visited, or maybe group hover, but there's a whole list of them now that we can use. So these are just even some of the examples. There's more still that we can use, like nth child and other things there. The format for these are the state, then a separator, and then the class name. So every class that Tailwind is generated potentially can be handled by an interaction, which we'll see. So an example being hover text red 500. So the state being hover, then the colons, the default separator is the colon. You can change that if you need to, and then we can just add our class there. This is what it generates. So text red 500 has that particular color, that hex code. Hover is looking for the hover pseudo selector. The colon is escaped. Same for focus there. So again, if you're using something where you can't use the colon for some reason, you can change it in the configuration file, and you can have it use something else as a separator. Also, I don't think I cover it here, but you can also prefix everything. So like for Drupal 7, I found that there's a block class that a block HTML element that Drupal uses for blocks, and that would conflict with display block in Tailwind. So you can also add prefixes like TW dash or something to the beginning as well. And this is how we'd use it in our markup. So our class is, our link is going to be text red 500 by default. And then when you hover over it, it's going to be text red 800. There are some variants. So this is the default, Tailwind's default config, where we can configure what gets generated when. So in earlier versions of Tailwind, this was called modules, but it's now called variants. So not everything gets generated all the time. So for example, background color will have responsive hover focus. The light appearance is only going to have responsive, for example. So if you did want to add, add some or take some away, you do that within your configuration file, which we'll look at later. As you've seen, everything is also responsive, so it does encourage that sort of mobile-first approach typically. Very similar syntax again, but we're going to prefix everything with the screen name this time. Then our separator and then our class. So the screens are set inside our config file. So small screens is 640 pixels, medium is 768, etc. So okay, these are the defaults. You can add more, you can take some away. I've added 2XL and 3XL for a lot of projects. Or if your version of medium is slightly different, you can configure that the way you want to. But these are the default values that Tailwind offers. And what we'll do is we'll take the names there on the left-hand side and use those as our prefixes. So like we saw in the vision example, we can use, say, MD flex to do display flex, but only on medium screens. And medium screens being 760 and above, because everything is mobile first. We can chain them as well. So we can say things should only be background red 500 on hover on medium screens, which again is pretty cool. So as I said, everything is just mobile first. So we can say our normal dot block is display block. But what's going to happen is when Tailwind is compiling, it's going to take the screen names and sizes and generate the appropriate media queries, minimum width media queries from there. And within our markup, we can just, in our markup, we can say, in this case, our wrapping div is display block by default, and then flex on medium screens. And our little columns there are width full, so 100% width on mobile, and then 1/2 on medium screens. So how do we control the file size? All of these things are adding a lot of file size by default, and we're not going to want to ship all of those things onto production. So we can use some of the config we've already seen to disable variants that we're not going to use, and maybe plugins we're not going to use as well. So this section of the config file that we saw earlier, we can include a Tailwind .config.js file, which we can use to configure it to ourselves, our own needs, and we can remove anything that we don't want to use from here. So if, for example, we're not going to use a line itself utilities at all, then we can just set that to false, and it won't generate any align self classes. And maybe in our project, we're only going to want to override background color on responsive, not on hover and focus, so only generate the responsive classes. So that's one way of manually removing them. So this is an example of a Tailwind config file where we've got some screens and some colors, everything set up there. And again, if we don't maybe want an Excel screen on your project, you can take out the Excel value and it won't generate those classes. So it will save like a quarter of your style sheet will go away at that point. And again, we can change, if you don't want all the grays, we can remove the ones we don't want, or we can override them completely. But that needs to be done manually by the person. There is an option to do this automatically remove what we don't need. This is using a tool called PurgeCSS. So this is using, again, we can install it through npm. This is including a Laravel mix specific plugin for Purge, although there are various other ones that you can use. Full Human do one that you can use, which is not tied to mix, which I use quite a lot. And then to use it, we're going to just require mix as we did before, use the same PurgeCSS section at the beginning, but then we can use .PurgeCSS and configure pass configuration values through to Purge itself. So what we're basically saying is scan through everything inside our template directory that is .html, .php, or .twig, and scan through, look for classes that you've used and keep them. Anything else, throw them away. So if maybe we don't use our align justify self variables anywhere, they will get purged out automatically for us. Yeah, again, these are configurable. So if you're doing something slightly different, you can add different directories or different extensions there. This is great if you're using like static sites or something like Symfony or Laravel, where you've got a lot more stuff in templates. It can be a bit tricky if you're doing Drupal or WordPress, because your classes could be coming from anywhere, possibly coming from a pre-processed function in a Drupal project, or something that's maybe not overly somewhere you need to also include those extra directories and things inside here. Something pretty cool is Tailwind 1.4 was released this week, last week, possibly this week, and also it includes PurgeCSS now by default, which is pretty cool. So you had to include it yourself in the previous versions, but now it's there by default, and we can just configure it by using a purge key inside inside your configuration file. This is pretty cool. I've not played with it yet, but I'm quite curious to see how that implementation works. The next thing I want to touch on and talk about is maintainability. So a lot of people have, when they first see this sort of approach, they sort of look at it and go, this must be really hard to maintain because you've got all these repeating classes everywhere for things like buttons and other, so if you've got blocks in Drupal or widgets in WordPress and you've got all these, the same classes around everywhere. Tailwind sort of advocates for avoiding repetition by extracting components, particularly HTML or JavaScript components, so Drupal partials or WordPress template parts or like blade components or twig components. And I think the interesting thing that this does is it almost makes you think and does something justify becoming a component. So not if you've got a navbar again, for example, you've only got one navbar, so you don't need to extract a component for that, unless you're doing it for some sort of readability reason. It does avoid sort of prematurely abstracting everything out into components. And can the duplication be moved elsewhere? So in the example of a Drupal block or a WordPress widget, we could split that up into all a particular component and then import it. So that duplication, there is no duplication now because everything is still inside one file. It might be pulled into multiple places, but it's from a maintainability perspective, it's only you've only got that combination of classes in one place in your project. So here's an example using a loop. So this is a navigation item. I think this is from my website or from the early version of it. I've got a navigation items array, which gets a loop over that. It comes from a settings file. I think it's from a sculpting project, which could loop over each of these, output each a tag, each link, and just replace the title and the URL in the correct place. So the point with this is that combination of classes for this link is only actually included once, although it will be output n number of times, like 5, 10, 100 times. So people looking at the compiled CSS through or HTML through DevTools or something obviously won't see that side of things, but from a maintainability perspective, we're avoiding that duplication by using the loop. And if we wanted to change a padding or the text size or the color or add something else here, we can do it in one place, and then when Twig in this case is going to compile, it'll handle the duplication for us. Here's an example of using partials. So again, this is another sculpting project for a jiu-jitsu class that I was school that I train at. In this case, we're going to extract the class list out, so a list of classes at the academy rather than a CSS class list. And what we're going to do is pass through the dynamic parts, the bits that change. So we've got different jiu-jitsu classes for adults versus kids, not versus kids, different jiu-jitsu classes for adults are different classes for kids, not at the same time, obviously. And what we're doing is passing through the dynamic parts into a loop. So I thought I had an example of that right there, but I don't, unfortunately. So all the repeated classes are within inside that class list partial, and we're just injecting the dynamic data for it to loop over. There's also an option to use an apply directive. So for something like a button where making an actual HTML file maybe doesn't make much sense, we can use this apply directive, which again is a PurgeCSS directive added by Tailwind. And we can basically use all the classes or any class as a mix-in essentially. So we can apply these things together in our CSS. So it's sort of a little bit similar to an extend in SAS, but what you're getting is everything is still coupled to that actual button. So it's much better than the way. And the advantage are you're still using the same sort of design patterns, the same constraints, and the same colors and the same margin padding values as before. The only thing that doesn't accommodate for is using those pseudo selectors. So things like hover, you currently, I don't think still can't apply hover : something. You have to write the hover version out and apply the thing separately. Although I think hopefully this is going to make that change at some point. That would be pretty cool. So using these apply directives, this is what we get. So what we don't have is like a SAS extend with everything that extends it in one go. We get our button with its own properties that are all inherited from the classes that we would have, the same classes we could have applied in the markup, just applied in our CSS directly. As I've said, we can customize Tailwind. Everything we've sort of done and looked at really so far has been done using the default settings. So we can generate our own settings file using Tailwind init, and that will generate a file like this. So it's just a JavaScript file. So it exports an object of configuration, exports your own configuration object, and this is where we can make our own additions and overrides and changes. So all of the colors and spacing values and everything come under this theme key. There's a subkey called extend. If you want to add another color red, for example, you can extend the existing versions. So you keep the existing color reds and add your own one on top rather than overriding them. If you were to do that inside theme, then it would override them completely. Then we can add plugins and any variants that we want to configure there. So everything comes in from the default config. This gets merged on top of the defaults, and yeah, this is where you make all your changes. Compared to the early Tailwind versions, you had everything in this file, but this is nice. It's just your overrides and your additions. So yeah, if you wanted to add an inherit color, we can do that by putting it inside theme and inside colors, and that will add it to our generated CSS. Because it's placed where it is inside theme, it will override all the colors, in fact, which we don't want to do. So if we want to extend the colors, we can put it inside extend, and it will add it in addition to the default color palette that Tailwind gives us. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier on, we can prefix everything, so we can add a prefix to every class that it generates. It's like the Drupal block example again. Typically, it's people add TW- or U- to the beginning of the class to avoid that conflict. Obviously, there's no prefix set by default, which is fine. And we can also include, if you want to have exclamation mark important for everything, we can set important to true if we're having specificity issues. If you didn't want to have everything, like all the default options and everything, then you can include the --full option, and it will include everything from the default config in your config. You can make all your changes there if you wanted to. We can extend Tailwind with plugins, as I said before. These typically are also all on npm as additional packages, so we can npm install them. And this is one that I wrote called Tailwind CSS list reset. So in previous versions of Tailwind before 1.0, there was a list reset class that reset the padding and the list style on the ordered and ordered lists. It was removed prior to 1.0, but for legacy reasons, if nothing else, just keep that present in my project, I decided to wrap it up into a plugin and leave that as a separate thing. So once I've installed it, I can then require it as a plugin inside that plugins array. And this is what it's going to generate. So it's just list reset class with list on none and padding 0. It's a really simple piece of CSS that you want to use, that you want to add. This is how it gets generated. So this can be done inside the plugins key that we saw inside the config file directly, or like this is inside an index.js file if you're going to want to package it up. Tailwind gives us this add utilities method that we can use, and in this case, all we're going to do is include our list reset class. So super simple example. And then at the end, they was going to pass to our variants to make sure we get our responsive versions and our interaction state versions as well. So super easy. We do have a little bit of time for a demo. I don't have much particularly sort of planned out. It's a little bit of an ad hoc demo. If I could get Chrome to open. Where are you, Chrome? Okay, so this is just a really simple CSS demo. So yeah, this is the file that we're using. Just a really plain HTML file. Nothing in the head apart from the title and the link. So in the Tailwind CDN version, so literally everything here. If I can find one, like XL delay 150. So again, because of the cascade, we're going to want to put all the largest screens at the end so that everything overrides itself. Everything overrides properly and cascades properly. Okay, so we can just start adding things into this file. So let's see if I can maybe make this over here. We can do a little bit better. So yeah, it's a little bit ad hoc. I don't have anything particularly planned. Let's just see what we can do. So we'll notice that the H1 is unstyled by default intentionally. So we can include something like a text 5XL. I think it's a 5XL to maybe make this a bit bigger. Let me see if I can. No, there we go. Let's do this, but the side-by-side thing. To make that a little bit bigger, because we want to include default bold, so make it bold, maybe a bit bolder. Oh, it's bolder, not a thing. Bold. Oh well, it's text well. Oh, got slightly bolder, I think. Did it? See something changing. Oh well. Maybe we want to make this uppercase. Usually I use a VS Code plugin for this and it gives me some auto completion. So I'm a little bit blind here in some ways. Let's see, maybe you want to have an underline in here as well. So we can underline this. We can see that I've not written any custom CSS for this at all. But maybe you want to put it in MX Auto. Nope. I'll be able to.
Hey, Oliver.
Block. Hey.
Hey, got about 5 minutes, so I guess you can take some questions. And,
yeah, okay. I'll just add a couple more things in here really quick. So we can add some things onto our body to style the body elements itself. We can do that. Maybe let's make it slightly lighter. And maybe we want to put make this text blue. Yeah, okay. So you can see exactly what we can do here. So there's lots of things we could do, like adding. Let's go add a. Yeah, let's add some images in here really quick and just do some really quick flexbox stuff. So let's maybe just grab this image of me. So I'd like to show some of the layout things in here very quickly. Let's just make a few versions of me. There we go. Yeah, I'm conscious of the time. Let's add a few things onto here. So rounded, roll around those, and then if you want to put them as a flexbox, maybe you do class flex to inline them. And this is where I could probably use one of the space things as well. So if you want to maybe do space 6. Yeah, so this is one of the new ones that's been added in quite recently. So this is going to add some spacing around each one. And again, if you really wanted this to do it on large screens, we could just say medium flex and medium. So yeah, on the small screen, it's going to stack them and not flexbox them and not add that space. And maybe very quickly, we just want to put space Y6 to give it some space. And then we're going to want to reset that on the medium screen. So yeah, now you've got a bit of space vertically between the two, and then now we get them bits around as well. It's fine to see 4 versions of me on a page, but yeah, there's just a really quick demo of some things we can do. There's some useful links. There's a link there to a Drupal theme, a starter kit theme that I've been maintaining. If people want to try this in Drupal, yeah, maybe take a look at some blog posts that I've written and some GitHub repositories as well from there. So yeah, a few minutes of questions. If anybody has any questions, this is a link to this talk. The slides are on my website. And yeah, feel free to follow me, ask me anything on Twitter, and follow along for some tips as well. Anybody have any questions? Anybody been looking at Tailwind and thinking about doing it and now want to maybe start using it? Okay, if there aren't any questions, I guess we can wrap it up. Yeah, again, take a look at some of these links after the fact if anybody wants to. Tailwind CSS is the docs website with a lot of these examples on some screencasts there that Adam, the maintainer, one of the maintainers, has been working on. Tailwind UI is a new thing. It's a paid component library, so it doesn't include any components by default, as I said, but you can pay, and they're always adding new components for sort of nav bars and things that you can use and customize. Adam does frequent live streaming on his YouTube channel, where he's either working on Tailwind itself or building UIs, like existing UIs of Tailwind. So like the Bartik one that I did, he's done several. And yeah, a few sort of blog posts about things as well, about Tailwind as well. I'm just trying to fill up time now, but yeah, this is the Bartik clone very quickly that I did. So this is the Drupal 7 theme clone, which should be pretty familiar to everybody. And this is nice and responsive as well. There's a link here to a blog post I did about it. If I make it a bit small, we get the little drop-down menu as well. So it's done with VJS. Although I do have a pull request open for using it with Alpine as well. And this is another clone that I've built, which is Acquia's hosting dashboard, which is also built with Tailwind, but also uses Vue behind the scenes. Something has changed with this font bold thing, because they're not right here either. I'm going to look into this afterwards, but again, this is a nice responsive layout. If I could find it, it's gone. So yeah, again, it's like sort of responsive layout with Tailwind. So 2 completely visually looking websites built with the same framework, which I think is pretty cool. Both of those are both on GitHub if people want to check them out after the fact. Yeah, if no one's got any questions, that's I'll be around in Slack a bit for a little bit, I guess, in and out for the rest of the evening, and feel free to hit me up and follow me on Twitter and ask any questions there afterwards if people do think of anything.
All right, thank you, Oliver.
Thanks very much.